Welcome to the 1,000 Nights and One Night. Now, when it was the 366th night, she said, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when the prince heard their answer, he was certified that the sage had taken her away, the maiden, and abode confounded and perplexed concerning his case. And he was abashed before the folk, and turning to his sire, told him what had happened, and said to him, Take the troops, and march them back to the city. As for me, I will never return till I have cleared up this affair. When the king heard this, he wept, and he beat his chest, and said to him, O my son, calm thy choler, and master thy chagrin, and come home with us, and look what king's daughter thou wouldst fain have, that I may marry thee to her. But the prince paid no heed to his word, and farewelling him departed, whilst the king returned to the city, and their joy was changed into sore annoy. Now as destiny issued her decree, when the prince left the princess in the garden house, and betook himself to his father's palace for the ordering of his affair, the Persian entered the garden to pluck certain simples, and scenting the sweet savour of musk and perfumes that exhaled from the princess, and impregnated the whole place, followed it till he came to the pavilion, and saw standing at the door the horse which he had made with his own hands. His heart was filled with joy and gladness, for he had bemoaned its loss much since it had gone out of his hands. So he went up to it, and examining its every part, found it whole and sound. Whereupon he was about to mount and ride away, when he bethought himself and said, Needs must I first look what the prince hath brought, and left here with the horse. So he entered the pavilion, and seeing the princess sitting there, as she were the sun, shining sheen in the sky, serene, knew her at first glance to be some high-born lady, and doubted not that the prince had brought her thither on the horse, and left her in the pavilion, whilst he went into the city to make ready for her entry in a state procession with all its splendor. Then he went up to her and kissed the ground between her hands, whereupon she raised her eyes to him, and finding him exceedingly foul of face and favour, asked, Who art thou? And he answered, O my lady, I am the messenger sent by the prince, who hath bidden me bring thee to another pleasure near the city. For that my lady the queen cannot walk so far, and is unwilling of her joy in thee, that another should forestall her with thee. Quoth she, Where's the prince? And quoth the Persian, He's in the city with his sire, and forthwith he shall come for thee in great state. Said she, O thou, say me, could he find none handsomer to send me? Whereat loud laughed the sage, and said, Yes, yea, verily, he hath a Mameluke as ugly as I am, but, O my lady, let not the ill favour of my face, and the foulness of my form, deceive thee. Hast thou profited of me as hath the prince? Verily thou wast praised my affair. Indeed, he chose me as his messenger to thee because of my uncomeliness and loathsome in his jealousy of love of thee. Else hath he a Mameluke and negro slaves, pages, eunuchs, and attendants out of number, each goodlier than the other. Whenas she heard this, it commended itself to her reason, and she believed him. So she rose forthright. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased saying her permitted say. Now, when it was the 367th night, she said, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when the Persian sage acquainted the princess with the case of the king's son, she believed him. So she rose forthright, and putting her hand in his, said, O my father, what hast thou brought me to ride? He replied, O my lady, thou shalt ride the horse thou camest on. And she said, I cannot ride it by myself. Whereupon he smiled, and he knew that he was her master, and he said, I will ride thee myself. So he mounted, and taking her upon, bound her to himself with firm bonds, while she knew not what he would with her. Then he turned the ascent pin, whereupon the belly of the horse became full of wind, and it swayed to and fro like the wave of the sea, and rose with them high in the air, nor slackened in its flight, till it was out of sight of the city. Now, when Shams al-Nahar saw this, she asked him, Ho thou, What has become of that thou toldest me of my prince, making me believe that he sent thee to me? Answered the Persian, Allah damn the prince, he's mean and skin-flint knave. She cried, Woe to thee! How darest thou disobey thy lord's commandment? Whereto the Persian replied, He is no lord of mine. Knowest thou who I am? Rejoined the princess, I know nothing of thee save what thou toldest me. And he retorted, What I told thee was a trick of mine against thee and the king's son. I have long lamented the loss of this horse which is under us, for I constructed it and made myself master of it. But now I have gotten firm hold of it, and of thee too, and I will burn his heart even as he hath burnt mine. Nor shall he ever have the horse again. No, never. So be of good cheer, and keep thine eyes cool and clear, for I can be of more use to thee than he, and I am generous as I am wealthy. My servants and slaves shall obey thee as their mistress. I will robe thee in the finest raiment, and thine every wish shall be at thy will. When she heard this, she buffeted her face, and cried out, saying, Oh, well away, I have not won my beloved, and I have lost my father and mother. And she wept bitter tears over what had befallen her, whilst the sage fared on with her without ceasing, till he came to the land of the Greeks, and alighted in a verdant meadow, abounding in streams and trees. Now, this meadow lay near a city wherein was a king of high puissance, and it chanced that he went forth that day to hunt and divert himself. And as he passed by the meadow, he saw the Persian standing there with the damsel and the horse by his side. And before the sage was ware, the king's slaves fell upon him and carried him and the lady and the horse to their master, who, noting the foulness of the man's favor, and his loathsome, and the beauty of the girl and her loveliness, said, O my lady, what kin is this oldster to thee? The Persian made haste to reply, saying, She is my wife, and the daughter of my father's brother. But the lady at once gave him the lie, and said, O king, by Allah, I know him not, nor is he my husband. Nay, he is a wicked magician, who hath stolen me away by force and fraud. Thereupon the king bade Bastino the Persian, and they beat him till he was well nigh dead, after which the king commanded to carry him to the city and cast him into jail. And he, taking from him the damsel and the ebony horse, though he knew not its properties nor the secret of its motions, set the girl in his seraglio, and the horse amongst his hoards. Such was the case with the sage and the lady. But as regards Prince Kamar Akmar, he garbed himself in traveling gear, and taking what he needed of money, set out tracking their trail in very sorry plight, and journeyed from country to country and city to city, seeking the princess and inquiring about the ebony horse, whilst all who heard him marveled at him and deemed his talk extravagant. Thus they continued doing a long while, but for all his inquiry and quest, he could hit on no news of her. At last, he came to her father's city of Sa'ana, and there asking for her, but could get no tidings of her, and found her father mourning her loss. So he turned back and made for the land of the Greeks, continuing to inquire concerning the twain as he went. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. Now, when it was the 368th night, she said, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that the king's son made for the land of the Greeks, continuing to inquire concerning the two as he went along, till as chance would have it, he alighted at a certain khan and saw a company of merchants sitting at talk. So he sat down near and heard one of them say, O my friends, I lately witnessed a wonder of wonders. They asked, What was it? I was visiting such a district in such a city, naming the city wherein the princess was, and I heard its people chatting of a strange thing which had lately befallen. It was that their king went out one day hunting and coursing with a company of his courtiers and the lords of his realm, and issuing from city they came to a green meadow, where they espied an old man standing with a woman, sitting hard by a horse of ebony. The man was foulest foul of face and loathly of form, but the woman was a marvel of beauty and loveliness and elegance and perfect grace. And as for the wooden horse, it was a miracle. Never saw eyes aught goodlier than it was more gracious than its make. Asked the others, and what did the king with them? And the merchant asked, as for the man, the king seized him and questioned him of the damsel, and he pretended that she was his wife and the daughter of his paternal uncle. But she gave him the lie forthright and declared that he was a sorcerer and a villain. So the king took her from the old man, and bade beat him and cast him into the trunk house. As for the ebony horse, I know not what became of it. When the prince heard these words, he drew near to the merchant and began questioning him discreetly and courteously, touching the name of the city and of its king, which when he knew, he passed the night full of joy. And as soon as dawned the day, he set out and travelled sans surcease till he reached that city. But when he would have entered, the gatekeepers laid hands on him, that they might bring him before the king to question him of his condition, and the craft in which he skilled, and the cause of his coming thither, such being the usage and custom of their ruler. Now, it was supper time when he entered the city, and it was then impossible to go into the king, or take counsel with him respecting the stranger. So the guards carried him to the jail, thinking to lay him by the heels there for the night. But when the warders saw his beauty and loveliness, they could not find it in their hearts to imprison him. They made him sit with them without the walls. And when food came to them, he ate with them what sufficeth him. As soon as they had made an end of eating, they turned to the prince and said, What countryman art thou? I come from Fars, answered he, the land of Khosrow. When they heard this, they laughed, and one of them said, O Khosrow, I have heard the talk of men and their histories, and I have looked into their conditions, but never saw I or heard I a bigger liar than the Khosrow which is with us in the jail. Quoth another, and never did I see aught fouler than his favour, or more hideous than his visnomy. Asked the prince, What have you seen of his lying? And they answered, He pretendeth that he is one of the wise. Now the king came upon them as he went hunting, and found with him a most beautiful woman, and a horse of the blackest ebony. Never saw I one handsomer. As for the damsel, she was with the king, who is enamoured of her, and would fain marry her, but she is mad, and were this man a leech as he claimeth to be, he would have healed her. For the king doth his utmost to discover a cure for her case, and a remedy for her disease. And this whole year hath passed, he spent treasures upon physicians and astrologers on her account, but none can avail to cure her. As for the horse, he's in the royal hoard house, and the ugly man is here with us in prison. And as soon as night falleth, he weepeth and bemoaneth himself, and will not let us sleep. And Scheherazade perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. Now, when it was the 369th night, she said, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when the warders had recounted the case of the Persian agromancer, they held in prison, and his weeping and wailing, the prince at once devised a device whereby he might compass his desire. And presently the guards of the gate, being minded to sleep, led him into the jail and locked the door. So he overheard the Persian weeping and bemoaning himself in his own tongue, and saying, Alack and alas for my sin, that I sinned against myself and against the king's son, in which I did with the damsel, for I neither left her nor won my will of her. All this cometh of my lack of sense, in that I sought for myself that which I deserved not, which befitted not the like of me. For whoso seeketh what suiteth him not at all, falleth and faileth with the like of my fall. Now, when the king's son heard this, he accosted him in Persian, saying, How long will this weeping and wailing last? Say, methinkest thou hath befallen thee that which never befell other than thou. Now when the Persian heard this, he made friends with him, and began to complain to him of his case and misfortunes. And as soon as the morning morrowed, the warders took the prince, and carried him before their king, informing him that he had entered the city on the previous night, at a time when audience was impossible. Quoth the king to the prince, Whence comest thou, and what is thy name and trade, and why hast thou travelled hither? He replied, As to my name, I am called in Persian Harja. As to my country, I come from the land of Fars, and I am of the men of art, and especially of the art of medicine, and healing the sick, and whom the jinns drive mad. For this I go around about all countries and cities to profit by adding knowledge to my knowledge. And whenever I see a patient, I heal him, and this is my craft. Now when the king heard this, he rejoiced with exceeding joy, and said, Oh, excellent sage, thou hast indeed come to us at a time when we need thee. Then he acquainted him with the case of the princess, adding, If thou cure her and recover her from her madness, thou shalt have of me everything thou seekest. Replied the prince, Allah save and favor the king. Describe to me all thou hast seen of her insanity, and tell me how long it is since the access attacked her. Also, how thou camest by her, and the horse and the sage. So the king told him the whole story, from first to last, adding, The sage is in gaol. Quoth the prince, O auspicious king, and what hast thou done with the horse? Quoth the king, O youth, it is with me yet, laid up in one of my treasure chambers. Whereupon the prince said to himself, The best thing I can do is first to see the horse and assure myself of its condition. If it be whole and sound, all will be well, and end well. But if its motor works be destroyed, I must find some other way of deliverance of my beloved. Thereupon he turned to the king and said to him, O king, I must see the horse in question. Happily I may find in it somewhat will serve me for the recovery of the damsel. With all my heart, replied the king, and taking him by the hand, showed him into the place where the horse was. The prince went round about it, examining its conditions, and found it whole and sound. Whereat he rejoiced greatly, and said to the king, Allah save and exalt the king. I would fain go in to the damsel, that I may see how it is with her, for I hope in Allah to heal her by my healing hand through means of the horse. Then he bade them take care of the horse, and the king carried him to the princess' apartment, where her lover found her wringing her hands, and writhing and beating herself against the ground, and tearing her garments to tatters, as was her wont. But there was no madness of jinn in her, and she did this but that none might approach her. When the prince saw her thus, he said to her, No harm shall betide thee, O ravishment of the three worlds, and went on to soothe her and speak her fair, till he managed to whisper, I am Kamar al-Akmar. Whereupon she cried out with a loud joy, and fell down fainting for excess of joy. But the king thought this was epilepsy, brought on by her fear of him, and by her suddenly being startled. Then the prince put his mouth to her ear, and said to her, O Shams al-Nahar, O seduction of the universe, have a care for thy life and mine, and be patient and constant, for this our position needeth sufferance and skillful contrivance to make shift for our delivery from this tyrannical king. My first move will be now to go out to him and tell him that thou art possessed of a jinn, and hence thy madness, but that I will engage to heal thee and drive away the evil spirit, if he will at once unbind thy bonds. So when he cometh into thee, do thou speak him smooth words, that he may think I have cured thee, and all will be done for us as we desire. Quoth she, hearkening in obedience. And he went out to the king in joy and gladness, and said to him, O august king, I have by thy good fortunes discovered her disease and its remedy, and have cured her for thee. So now thou go into her, and speak her softly, and treat her kindly, and promise her what may please her. So shall all her desires of her be accomplished to thee. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. Now, when it was the 370th night, she said, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that when the prince feigned himself a leech, and went into the damsel, and made himself known to her, and told her how he proposed to deliver her, she said, hearkening and obedience, He then fared forth from her and sought the king, and said, Go thou into her, and speak her softly, and promise her what may please her, so shall all thy desires of her be accomplished to thee. Thereupon the king went into her, and when she saw him, she rose, and kissing the ground before him, bade him welcome, and said, I admire how thou hast come to visit thy handmaid this day. Whereat he was ready to fly for joy, and bade the waiting women and the eunuchs attend her, and carried her to the hamman, and make ready for her dresses and adornment. So they went into her and saluted her, and she returned their salams with the goodliest language, after the pleasant fashion. Whereupon they clad her in royal apparel, and clasping a collar of jewels around her neck, carried her to the bath, and served her there. Then they brought her forth as she were the full moon. When she came into the king's presence, she saluted him, and kissed before him the ground. Whereupon he joyed in her with joy exceeding, and said to the prince, O sage, O philosopher, all this is thy blessing. Allah increaseth to the benefit of thy healing breath. The prince replied, O king, for the completion of her cure, it behoveth that thou go forth, thou and all thy troops and guards, to the place where thou foundest her, not forgetting the beast of black wood which was with her, for therein is a devil. And unless I exorcise him, he will return to her and afflict her at the head of every month. With love and gladness, cried the king. O thou prince of all philosophers, and most learned of all who see the light of day. Then he brought out the ebony horse to the meadow in question, and rode thither with all his troops and the princess, little weeting the purpose of the prince. Now when they came to the appointed place, the prince, still habited as the leech, bade them set the princess and the steed as far as I could reach from the king and his troops, and said to them, With thy leave and at thy word, I will now proceed to the fumigations and conjurations, and here imprison the adversary of mankind, that he may never more return to her. After this, I shall mount this wooden horse, which seemeth to be made of ebony, and take the damsel up behind me, whereupon it will shake and sway to and fro and fare forwards, till it come to thee, with the affair will be at an end. And after this, thou mayest do with her as thou wilt. When the king heard his words, he rejoiced with such extreme joy. So the prince mounted the horse, and put the damsel up behind him, whilst the king and his troops watched him, bound her fast to him. Then he turned the ascending pin, and the horse took flight, and soared with them high into the air, till they disappeared from every eye. After this, the king abode half the day, expecting their return, but they returned not. So when he, despairing of them, repenting him greatly of what he had done, and grieving sore for the loss of the damsel, he went back to the city with his troops. He then sent for the Persian, who was in the prison, and said to him, O thou traitor, O thou villain, why didst thou hide from me the mystery of the ebony horse? And now a sharper hath come to me, and hath carried it off, taking with her the slave girl, whose ornament are worth a mint of money, and I shall never see anyone or anything of them again. So the Persian related to him all his past, first and last. And the king was seized with a fit of fury which nigh ended his life. He shut himself in his palace for a while, mourning and afflicted. But at last his wazirs came in to him, and applied themselves to comfort him. Verily, he who took the damsel is an enchanter, and praise be Allah who hath delivered thee from his craft and sorcery. And they ceased not from him, till he was comforted for her loss. Thus far concerning the king. But as for the prince, he continued his career towards his father's capital, in joy and cheer, and stayed not till he alighted on his own palace, where he set the lady in safety, after which he went into his father and mother, and saluted them, and acquainted them with her coming, whereat they were filled with solace and gladness. Then he spread great banquets for the townsfolk. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased saying her permitted say. Now, when it was the 371st night, she said, It hath reached me, O auspicious king, that the king's son spread great banquets for the townsfolk, and they held high festival a whole month, at the end of which time he went into the princess, and they took their joy of each other with exceeding joy. But his father brake the Ebony Horse in pieces and destroyed its mechanisms for flight. Moreover, the prince wrote a letter to the princess' father, advising him of all that had befallen her, informing how she was now married to him in all health and happiness, and sent it by a messenger, together with costly presents and curious rarities. And when the messenger arrived at the city, which was Sana, and delivered the letter and presents to the king, he read the missive, and he rejoiced greatly thereat, and accepted the presents, honoring and rewarding the bearers handsomely. Moreover, he forwarded rich gifts to his son-in-law by the same messenger, who returned to his master and acquainted him with what had passed, whereat he was much cheered. And after this the prince wrote a letter every year to his father-in-law, and sent him presents, till in course of time his King Sabur, deceased, and he reigned in his stead, ruling justly over his lieges, and conducting himself well and righteously towards them, so that the land submitted to him, and his subjects did loyal service. And Kamar al-Akmar and his wife Shams al-Nahar abode in the enjoyment of all satisfaction and solace of life, till there came to them the destroyer of delights, and sunderer of societies, and plunderer of palaces, the caterer for cemeteries, and the garnerer of graves. And now glory be to the living one, who dieth not, and in whose hand is the dominion of the worlds, visible and invisible. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of the day, and ceased to say her permitted say. And so do I cease my tale for the day, till it be morrow.